you might turn to those chapters that we read together. You will remember, if you were with us last Sunday, that we were saying there were three decisions that we find scattered through these chapters that we've been reading. First of all, there was the decision of the Philistines to attack Israel. And then there was the decision that David had to make, and that's what we looked at last time, as a result of the life that he was living, and we'll remind ourselves of something of that in a few minutes. But then also there is the decision that Saul had to make. How was he going to respond to this attack of the Philistines? I want to begin, though, by thinking about the Philistine decision to attack Israel, because it so much sets the context for what we're going to say about Saul. It wasn't so relevant to David, but it's far more relevant, as you'll see, to Saul. This attack by the Philistines upon Israel was devastating. Absolutely devastating. If you look at chapter 31 and verses 1 to 3. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. The Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchizedek, Saul's son. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded by the archers. It led to a civil war. It led to the division of Solomon's kingdom. Read something of that in verse 7 of this chapter. When the men of Israel were on the other side of the valley, and they were on the other side Jordan, saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. The division of the kingdom followed into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And down through history, the Lord's people have been ill-used. They've been persecuted. This here, where Israel is attacked by the Philistines, is just one example of the way in which the Lord's people have been abused by a fallen, sinful world. You read it all the way through the Old Testament, and of course in the New Testament, the church. What do we see? The persecution of the Lord's people come through to today, passing over all the martyrs and so on in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. You come to this day, and you see the way in which the people of God are treated. And because of that, I want to take you to Joel chapter 3 and remind you that this is not the end. The Lord's people being ground into the dust, the Lord's people being misused, abused. But if we look at the whole of history, eternity past to eternity future, we shall find a different story. I want to take you to Joel chapter 3. In the first few verses of this chapter, we're reminded of the way in which the Lord's people are misused. Look at verse 3. They have cast lots for my people, have given a boy for an harlot, and sold a girl for wine, that they might drink. Verse 5. Because ye have taken my silver and my gold, and have carried into your temples my goodly, pleasant things. The Lord's rehearsing, as it were, before the world, the way in which down through the centuries the Lord's people have been misused. Then in verses 8 to 12 of this chapter, the Lord challenges the world to come and do battle with him. Come and see what they can do against the Lord. And then at verse 12, for there will I sit to judge all the heathen round about. Put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, get you down, for the press is full, the fats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near. In the valley of decision, the sun and the moon shall be darkened, the stars shall withdraw their shining, and the Lord shall roar out of Zion, and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake. But the Lord will be the hope of his people, and the strength of his children Israel. We're so familiar with the way in which the Lord's people are persecuted and ill-used, Old Testament, New Testament, even today. But that's not the complete story. There will come a time when the nations are gathered to the valley of decision, as it's called here, when men and women have to appear before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of the deeds done in the body. Look again at verse 14. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. We've been talking about the decisions being made here by the Philistines, by David, by Saul. And our lives are made up of the decisions that we make. But remember that today is not everything. There will come a day when the Lord gathers men before his seat of judgment. And then we shall see, as the Lord sifts. The books are open. We have to give an account of the deeds done in the body, the decisions that have been made in our lives, the decisions that have made up your life and my life. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. And then to appear before the judgment seat of Christ. So one day, all these things will appear very different. But for our passage tonight, we see once again the way in which the Lord's people are misused. The Philistines attack Israel. I want to take this eternal context and, as it were, hang it over what we say tonight as we look at this passage. I'll remind you of what we said about David last week. We saw the way in which he was reluctant to give up the life of a lie that he was living. He was living there amongst the Philistines to shield himself from Saul. It wasn't a life of faith. It was a life of fear. And he'd gone there pretending to be one of the Philistine supporters. He went out every day robbing the Gershurites, the Gezerites, and the Amalekites. But he left no one alive. And when he came back and King Achish said to him, "Where have you been today?" he told him a lie. Oh, against the southern parts of Israel. Robbing his own people was the lie he told them. And Achish became confident that he was a man that he could trust. And he made him keeper of his own life. Verse 1 of chapter 28, it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare to fight with Israel. And Achish said unto David, "Know thou assuredly that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men." And David said to Achish, "Surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Therefore will I make thee keeper of mine head forever." His lying was so convincing when he told Achish that he was robbing his own people, that Achish felt he could trust his life to David. Then the time of decision came. The Philistines determined that they would attack Israel. And Achish sought to take David with him to fight against his own people. And David had to make a decision. And you remember we saw that he was loath to give up his double life. He was loath to give up that lie that he was living. But the Lord rescued him. the Lord rescued him. And amazingly, the Lord used the Philistine lords themselves. He stirred up the Philistines, the very Philistines, to refuse to allow Achish to take David into battle. And so David was sent home. He wasn't right with the Lord, but the Lord had taken him out of an impossible situation, the lie that he was living and was unwilling to give up. But the Lord rescued him from that. But he was still living a life of fear, still fearing Saul, fearing that he might fall into Saul's hand. He wasn't yet walking by faith. And so it was that as he went back to Ziklag, that city which Achish had given him, he found that the Amalekites had come and robbed the city, burned it, taken away all his relations. And then we find that David was changed. He encouraged himself, it says, in the Lord. The Lord rescued David, restored him to faith. And we were saying that that's a principle that the Lord has with his people. 1 Corinthians 10:13. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God will not suffer us to be tempted above that we're able to bear it, but will make a way of escape that we might be able to bear it. And so David was rescued. The Lord rescued David. But now we come to the problem of Saul and the decision that Saul has to make. We're told that Saul was afraid when he saw the attack of the Philistines. Verse 5 of chapter 28. When Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. What was he going to do with this great attack of these Philistine people? What was his decision going to be? Well, I want to look at Saul's decision now under three headings. First of all, the Lord is departed from Saul. Secondly, Saul adopts a new approach. And thirdly, next step for Saul, the valley of decision and judgment. So those three categories or headings. First of all, the Lord is departed from Saul. Saul began well. You remember how way back in chapter 10 we read about the way in which he was appointed in 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 22. The Lord answered, Behold, he hath hid himself among the stuff. And they ran and fetched him thence. And when he stood among the people, he was higher than many of the people from his shoulders and upwards. And Samuel said to all the people, You see him, whom the Lord hath chosen, that there is none like unto him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king. He was appointed, and it all looked so good. But then he spared Agag. When he was told to destroy the Amalekites and every living thing, he spared Agag. And we begin to see solemn warnings coming into Saul's life. 1 Samuel 15, verses 10 and onwards. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, I repented me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he is turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. And down in verse 23 of this chapter, for the rebellion is the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is an iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. The history of Saul, the way in which he was appointed, he was chosen of God, but he wasn't faithful. And step by step, He went away from the Lord, became more of an anathema to the Lord. Chapter 16 and verse 14. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Chapter 18 and verse 12. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. It's been a step-by-step process. Saul, from a great beginning, time after time, he's disobeyed the Lord. Notice particularly in his disobedience over the destruction of the Amalekites, he was warned by Samuel that disobedience is next door to witchcraft. So there's a warning there. And it's going to become relevant as we carry on in Saul's life, because he becomes involved in our reading tonight with witchcraft. Step by step. Multiple attempts to try and kill David. The slaying of the priests at Nob. Step by step, Saul goes away from the Lord. And it's not surprising then that we read that the Lord had departed from Saul. In 1 Chronicles chapter 10 and verse 13, we read this. So Saul died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit, to inquire of it. He'd done the very thing that he shouldn't have done. He'd abandoned the Lord, and he'd sought a familiar spirit. But look at verse 14 of 1 Chronicles 10. And inquired not of the Lord, therefore he slew him. But in our reading we found that Saul did inquire of the Lord. If you look at chapter 28, 1 Samuel chapter 28 and verse 6, we find when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. So why do those two accounts say different things? Chronicles that he didn't inquire of the Lord, and here that he did inquire of the Lord. Well, people have debated this, but I think the answer is very straightforward. Do you remember how when we talked about David? David was rescued by the Lord. He went back to Ziklag, and he found everything was gone, and his followers turned on him. And it says he encouraged himself in the Lord. Yes, he went to Urim and Thummim, but he encouraged himself in the Lord. There's nothing of that with Saul here. He goes through the motions. Mechanical Christianity, we might call it. He went through the motions. He went to Urim and Thummim, that way in which they got guidance in those days. It's not fully understood how they did it, but he went to Urim and Thummim, and he got nothing that way. And so he went to the medium to get advice. There was no tears. There was no encouraging himself in the Lord. There was no repentance, no going back to the Lord, seeking again those times of refreshing that he had known before. It was simple mechanical religion. And when that failed, he went to this medium. Something he'd been warned about, something he'd been warned not to do in earlier life, but now here he is inquiring of a medium. What a warning there is there for us against mechanical religion. Saul went through the motions, Urim and Thummim. But David, he encouraged himself in the Lord. And yes, he went to Urim and Thummim. But you see, the heart is not with what Saul is doing. With David, there is a broken heart. There is weeping. There is longing. There is intercession. With Saul, he goes through the motions, and when that doesn't work, he goes to a medium, seeking advice from a medium. Oh, how we need to heed this warning. Do you remember Joseph Hart's hymn? True religion's more than notion. Something must be known and felt. That was the difference between David and Saul. David longing for the Lord. Saul just wanting a quick answer by any magical means possible. And the warning to us, coming to service on the Lord's Day, that doesn't impress God. Coming to the Lord's table, that doesn't impress him. Going through the motions with our quiet time, that doesn't impress him. What he looks for is heart religion. That hunger for him. That seeking after him. Like David, encouraging him ourselves in the Lord. Well, Saul, having gone through the motions with Urim and Thummim, he now approaches this medium, this seeker of familiar spirits. Notice verse 3 of chapter 28. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and wizards out of the land. In earlier years he'd done that because he'd been warned that this was a sinful practice. It was an offense to Almighty God to seek those familiar spirits. He was put away. And yet he managed to find one through his followers. He's able to find one. But where did it get him? We won't go into the mechanism of what actually happened. There's been a big debate about it. But somehow he seems to have made contact with Samuel. And he's told towards the end of chapter 28, verses 18 and 19, because thou obeyest not the voice of the Lord, nor executeth his fierce wrath upon Amalek, therefore hath the Lord done this thing unto thee this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me, says Samuel. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. And Saul fell straightway along upon the earth and was sore afraid. He'd committed another sin. To all his failures, he'd added another, becoming involved with familiar spirits. Oh, how we need to be warned. Games that people play with Ouija boards and looking at the stars. Condemned. An offense. That's what Saul did. And you see the consequence here. And so, my third point, next step, Judgment Day. The valley of decision before the judgment seat of Christ. How would it be? How would it be with you and with me on that day? There's yet another sin that he commits. He commits suicide when he's struck by the arrow. You know that we're told, thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say, thou shalt not kill other people. It says, thou shalt not kill, including yourself. Other people, but yourself also. And yet he committed suicide. Next step for Saul. The valley of decision. The judgment seat of Christ. We must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. This is a serious episode. Saul coming to the end of his life. See what opportunities he began with. Step by step, he's turned his back upon the Lord. Decision after decision has been away from the Lord. Finally, we find him consulting a medium, committing suicide. How will it be with you on the day of judgment? When the books are opened and when your decisions are examined. Remember what we were reading there in the book of Joel, verse 14. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. It's a serious question. How will it be with you on that day? We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of the deeds done in the body, the decisions that we've made. Like David, like Saul. How will it be when one day we stand there? Or maybe perhaps your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Oh, pray God that it is. For that glorious sacrifice at Calvary is sufficient to cover all your decisions, bad though they may be. It was sufficient for David. He's a man after God's own heart. And when decision time came, God rescued him, took him away from the foolishness of his own heart and his liking of the prosperity of a life of a lie. But the Lord weaned him from that, took him to Ziklag, burned and destroyed and robbed, and caused him to turn again, encourage himself in the Lord. How is it with you? Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision.